To go from being a person who didn't like to fly to becoming a staunch advocate for aviation, flying safety, and in particular, spotlighting the role of women in aviation can sure be an interesting ride. And that's just the ride that Betty Haddon Moseley took. Betty was born in Duchesne, Utah in 1924 and was raised on the Haddon family ranch. When she met her husband-to-be Kent Moseley during World War II, Betty got her first taste of aviation. And as it turned out, it was not a good taste. Kent had arranged for Betty to accompany him on a flight in Alabama on a very hot summer day in a Beech AT-7. A fire in one of the engines was enough to have Betty think twice about ever flying again. After the war, Betty and Kent moved to Indiana, where he enrolled in the University of Indiana to begin his studies in the School of Dentistry. Betty also attended classes and began working full-time at the university. Upon graduation, they moved to Lexington, where Kent would begin his 53-year practice. Betty was with him and worked as his office manager and bookkeeper during the entire time. Betty always had a love for fashion and merchandising and thought she would give modeling a try. She soon found herself doing formal modeling and runway shows. Besides Lexington merchants, she was also photographed for Coca-Cola, Chevrolet, Frigidaire, and many others. Ken had become successful in his practice, but he had not taken time for flying, a love he had had since he was 5. He was determined to fly again, and with the thought of one day owning his own aircraft, he encouraged Betty to learn to fly. Although she was still apprehensive about the idea, she was determined to fly. In 1968, she soloed in the Piper Colt, and what started as a fear of flying became one of the most exciting things she had ever done. She not only overcame the fear, she now wanted to become an accomplished pilot. Betty was still new to flying when she heard all about the all-women transcontinental air race, or as humorist and aviation advocate Will Rogers dubbed it, the Powder Puff Derby, the largest and longest speed race in the world for women. Never one to do things on a small scale, Betty decided to give air racing a try. Unfortunately, her qualification at the time, number of hours and ratings, prevented her from participating in the race that year, but she was determined to succeed. In 1971, her dream of flying in the race was realized. With co-pilot Virginia Chamberlain, Betty took off from Calgary, Canada in her Piper 140B, the Smitten Kitten. The race would run 2,442 miles, terminating in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. It would be the 25th running of the race with 150 participants. Another pilot in the race was Fran Sallies of Baton Rouge. With only 230 hours, she was barely eligible to compete. Her co-pilot was a tiny Capuchin monkey named Sherry. Race officials decided to let the monkey race only because it was a female. In the next to last leg of the race, Fran had become disoriented. She was no longer sure of her position, and she was getting very low on fuel. Not able to reach the ground by radio, she decided to declare an emergency. She called Mayday. Being ahead and above Fran, Betty and Virginia, flying in the Smitten Kitten, were the only ones who heard the call. Slowing down and effectively dropping out of the race, Betty worked with the Little Rock approach control, and they together located Fran's position and got her and her aircraft down safely. Once they knew that Fran was okay, the Smitten Kitten was once again in the race. But the delay could cost race points for Betty. She was resigned to this because she knew she had helped a fellow pilot. As it later turned out, this unselfish act would prove to be a changing point in Betty's life. Because of her resourcefulness, sportsmanship, and flying proficiency, the Federal Aviation Administration presented Betty the Award for Distinguished Service in 1971 for her role in saving a fellow pilot from crashing during the race. In 1972, the FAA office in Louisville appointed her as an accident prevention counselor, and later that year she was asked to serve on the Women's Advisory Committee on Aviation. Betty was also asked to serve as chairman for Kentucky's first Aviation Week in 1972. During her planning for the event, she met Major General Freimeyer, who was head of the Kentucky Air National Guard. Seeing an opportunity to promote women's role in aviation, General Freimeyer arranged for Betty to participate in a training mission in one of the Air National Guard's F-101 Voodoo jet fighters. With Colonel Carl Black at the controls, they flew a low-level reconnaissance flight, and Betty became the first woman to fly a combat jet in Kentucky. Over the years, Betty continued to promote aviation and served as a frequent speaker in both public and civic functions as well as schools. She is a member of the Aviation Museum of Kentucky and continues to help in its mission of preservation and education. In 1991, she was asked to serve on the Board of Trustees for the National Aviation Hall of Fame in Dayton, Ohio, a post that she still fills today. From having a fear of flying to becoming an accomplished pilot traveling at Mach 1 in a Voodoo, to modeling and becoming a strong advocate of women's role in aviation, Betty's had quite the ride. It is therefore fitting that Betty Hayden Moseley be enshrined into the official Aviation Hall of Fame of the Commonwealth of Kentucky.